Millfield Valley had always been the kind of place where nothing ever happened. Rolling green pastures, weathered farmhouses, and the kind of quiet that city folks pay good money to experience on weekend getaways. But when Tom and Jake Henderson inherited their grandfather's 200-acre spread, they had no idea they were about to uncover the valley's darkest secret. The old red barn had been sealed tight for 50 years. Their grandfather had made them promise as children to never go inside, claiming it was structurally unsound. But with property taxes mounting and bills piling up, the brothers needed every inch of storage space they could get. What they found beneath those rotting floorboards wasn't just shocking, it was dangerous. Government files stamped with classifications that shouldn't exist. Photographs of experiments that violated every human rights treaty ever written, and a list of names that included some of the most powerful people in the country. Now the brothers face an impossible choice: expose the truth and risk everything, or stay silent and become complicit in crimes that span generations. But here's the real question. If you stumbled upon evidence of a 50-year cover-up, would you have the courage to speak up? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It had taken Tom Henderson 3 days to work up the courage to cut through the rusted chains that had kept the barn sealed since 1973. His younger brother Jake stood beside him now, bolt cutters trembling in his weathered hands as they stared at the heavy wooden doors that had been forbidden territory their entire lives. "Grandpa Joe's been dead 2 months, Tom said, more to convince himself than Jake. Whatever's in there, it can't hurt us now." The chains fell away with a metallic clatter that seemed to echo across the empty fields. Tom pulled the doors open, and 50 years of stale air rushed out to greet them. The smell was wrong. Not the earthy scent of old hay and farm equipment they'd expected, but something clinical and sharp that made their noses burn. But there were details that didn't belong. Electrical conduits ran along the walls in neat, purposeful lines. A modern ventilation system hummed quietly despite decades of neglect. And in the far corner, barely visible in the shadows, was a steel door that definitely hadn't been there when the barn was built in 1923. "Tom," Jake whispered, pointing to the floor. "Look at those marks." Deep grooves scored the wooden planks, as if something heavy had been dragged across them repeatedly. The marks led from the main entrance to that strange steel door, creating a path worn smooth by decades of use. The brothers exchanged glances. Neither spoke the question that hung between them. What had their grandfather been hiding? Jake approached the steel door first, his footsteps muffled by the thick dust. The door bore no markings except for a small slot that looked like it might once have held a keycard. He pressed his ear against the cold metal. "There's something down there," he said, his voice barely audible. "Air circulation. This thing's still active." Tom joined his brother, running his hands along the door's edges until he found what he was looking for. A manual release handle painted the same grey as the door itself. It took both brothers pulling together to wrench it open, the mechanism protesting with a screech of metal on metal. Beyond the door lay a staircase descending into darkness. Emergency lighting flickered to life automatically, casting everything in an eerie red glow. The clinical smell grew stronger, accompanied now by the hum of electronics that should have been dead for half a century. "We should call someone," Jake said, but his feet were already carrying him toward the stairs. "Call who?" Tom replied. "And tell them what?" The staircase ended in an underground corridor lined with concrete walls. More doors branched off to either side, each marked with symbols that neither brother recognized. At the end of the hall, one door stood ajar, spilling yellow light into the crimson-tinted darkness. Inside that room, filing cabinets lined every wall from floor to ceiling. A desk sat in the center, covered with documents and photographs that made Jake's stomach turn. But it was the wall map that held their attention. A detailed layout of Millfield Valley with their own farm marked in red, surrounded by circles indicating a radius of some kind. Tom picked up one of the photographs with shaking hands. It showed a group of children, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing in what looked like a medical facility. Their eyes were vacant, their expressions blank. At the bottom of the photo, someone had written in faded ink, Project Shepherdstown, Phase 3 subjects. "Jesus Christ," Jake breathed, reaching for a manila folder marked classified, eyes only. The first page contained a list of names, local families they'd known their whole lives, including their own. The metal ladder groaned under Jake's weight as he descended into the darkness, his phone's flashlight cutting through the stale air. Behind him, Marcus gripped the rungs with white knuckles, his breathing shallow and rapid. "This can't be real," Marcus whispered, his voice echoing off concrete walls. "Grandpa Joe grew corn and fixed tractors. He wasn't what?" Jake's boots hit solid ground with a hollow thud. The beam of his light swept across the underground chamber, revealing a space far larger than the barn above. Steel filing cabinets lined the walls like silent sentinels, and a massive desk dominated the center of the room. "Holy shit, Marcus, look at this place." The air smelled of old paper and something metallic, like pennies left too long in a pocket. Emergency lighting fixtures hung from the ceiling, connected to a generator that sat dormant in the corner. This wasn't some hastily constructed hiding spot. This was professional, permanent. Marcus dropped down beside him, fumbling for his own phone light. "The electricity bill," he said suddenly. "Remember how Grandpa's electric bill was always higher than it should have been for just the house? Mom used to joke about it." Jake was already moving toward the filing cabinets, drawn by magnetic curiosity and growing dread. The first drawer he tried was locked, but the second slid open with a whisper of well-oiled metal. Inside, manila folders hung in perfect order, each labeled with dates spanning from 1968 to 1979. His fingers traced the tabs: Operation Mockingbird, Project Stargate, COINTELPRO. "These are—" Jake pulled out a thick folder, his hands trembling slightly. "Marcus, these are classified documents, government stuff. Look at these stamps. Top secret, eyes only." Marcus peered over his shoulder as Jake opened the first file. Photocopied pages spilled out, dense with text and bearing the letterheads of agencies they'd only heard about in movies: CIA, NSA, FBI. Names were redacted in thick black ink, but dates and operational details remained visible. "Listen to this," Jake read aloud, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Subject demonstrates significant psychokinetic abilities under controlled laboratory conditions. Recommend immediate recruitment for Project Stargate Phase 2. Handler designation J. Henderson." The folder slipped from Marcus's nerveless fingers, scattering papers across the concrete floor. "J. Henderson. Jake, that's Grandpa Joe." Jake's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, as if speaking the truth plainly might make it less impossible. "Our grandfather was some kind of government operative." They stood in stunned silence, the weight of discovery settling around them like a shroud. The man who had taught them to fish, who made terrible pancakes every Sunday morning, who wore the same faded overalls for 30 years, that man had been living a double life involving psychic experiments and classified operations. Marcus bent to gather the scattered papers, his movements mechanical. "There's more here. Look at this. Financial records, bank account numbers, and this." He held up a photograph, black and white and slightly blurred. "Is that Grandpa?" Jake angled his light toward the image. A younger version of their grandfather stood beside a man in a dark suit, both of them flanking a woman who couldn't have been more than 20. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her hands were restrained behind her back. "What did he do?" Marcus's voice cracked. "What the hell did our grandfather do?" Before Jake could answer, a sound from above froze them both, the unmistakable creak of the barn door opening. Heavy footsteps crossed the wooden floor overhead, measured and deliberate. Not the hurried gait of someone discovering an open door, but the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Jake killed his phone light and grabbed Marcus's wrist, forcing him to do the same. In the sudden darkness, every sound amplified: their ragged breathing, the rustle of papers, the footsteps above that had now stopped directly over their heads. A beam of light suddenly pierced the darkness as someone above found the hidden entrance. The light swept the underground chamber methodically, professionally. "They're down there." The voice was calm, almost conversational, just like the old man said they'd be. Marcus pressed closer to Jake. Both brothers crouched behind the massive desk. Jake's mind raced through possibilities. Who were these people? How did they know about the bunker? And what did they mean by, just like the old man said? "Bring them up," another voice called from above. "And bring the files. All of them." Jake felt Marcus tense beside him, preparing to bolt, but there was nowhere to go. The ladder was their only exit, and it led straight into the hands of whoever was waiting above. The footsteps on the ladder began, slow, patient, inevitable. The metal ladder descended 15 feet into darkness before Jake's boots hit concrete. The air below was stale but surprisingly dry, carrying the faint scent of old paper and something else, something chemical that made his nose twitch. Behind him, Marcus fumbled with his phone's flashlight, the beam dancing wildly across rough concrete walls. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "This place is huge." Jake swept his own light across the bunker, revealing a space that stretched far beyond what should have been possible under the barn's footprint. Metal shelving units lined the walls, packed with boxes, file cabinets, and equipment he didn't recognize. Thick electrical cables snaked along the ceiling, disappearing into shadows that their phone lights couldn't penetrate. "Look at this," Marcus called from the far wall, where a large corkboard hung covered in yellowed papers, photographs, and what appeared to be organizational charts. Red string connected various pins, creating a web of relationships that meant nothing to Jake but looked disturbingly official. Jake approached one of the filing cabinets, noting the heavy-duty locks that had long since been broken. The top drawer slid open with surprising ease, revealing rows of manila folders marked with alphanumeric codes. He pulled one at random, Bluebird 47C. Inside were typewritten reports, carbon copies on thin paper that crackled at his touch. "Operation Mockingbird," he read aloud from one document header. "Media Asset Recruitment, Phase 3. What the hell does that mean? Marcus had moved to another section, where boxes labeled photographic evidence sat stacked 3 high. Jake continued reading, the words gradually forming a picture that made his stomach clench. Journalist recruitment, information management, narrative control. Names he recognized from newspapers and television listed alongside dollar amounts and operational designations. The dates were all from the mid-1970s, but the implications felt disturbingly relevant. A metallic crash echoed from Marcus's direction. Jake spun around to find his brother staring at a spilled box of photographs, his face pale in the phone light. "You need to see these," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake crossed to where black and white photographs lay scattered across the concrete floor. He knelt and gathered them up, his confusion deepening with each image. Government buildings, men in suits shaking hands, congressional hearings, and then, impossibly, their grandfather, young, maybe 40 years old, standing beside a man Jake recognized from history textbooks as a CIA director from the Nixon era. "That's Grandpa Joe," Marcus said unnecessarily. "But how is he? Why would he?" "I don't know." Jake's hands were shaking as he shuffled through more photographs. Their grandfather appeared, in at least a dozen images, sometimes in what looked like official meetings, other times in more casual settings. In one photo, he stood in front of the very barn they'd just broken into, but it looked different, newer, with additional structures that were no longer there. Marcus had found another box, this one filled with what appeared to be financial records. Bank statements, wire transfer receipts, payment authorizations, all bearing their grandfather's name and signatures. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing through accounts Jake had never heard of. "Mark, look at this date." Jake held up a bank statement. 3 days before Grandpa died, someone made a withdrawal of $50,000. "That's impossible. He was in the hospital for 2 weeks before." Marcus stopped mid-sentence, understanding passing between them like an electric current. Jake moved deeper into the bunker, following the electrical cables to what appeared to be a communications setup. Radio equipment, some of it clearly military surplus, sat on a long table beneath a pegboard hung with various tools and devices. A logbook lay open beside the radio, filled with entries in their grandfather's distinctive handwriting. The final entry was dated just 1 week before his death, asset compromised. Initiate containment protocol. "We need to get out of here," Marcus said suddenly, his voice tight with panic. "This is way bigger than we thought. If people died for this, if Grandpa was involved in something that got him killed." "Killed?" Jake looked up from the logbook. He had a heart attack. "Did he? Really?" Marcus gestured at the evidence surrounding them. "Look at all this. Government secrets, classified operations, payments that continued right up until he died. You think that's coincidence?" Jake wanted to argue, but the words stuck in his throat. The bunker, the photographs, the timing, it painted a picture he didn't want to accept but couldn't ignore. Their grandfather, the man who taught them to fish and fix engines and never tell lies, had been living a lie so massive it required an underground facility to contain it. From somewhere above them came the sound of car doors slamming. Both brothers froze, straining to hear over their own thundering heartbeats. Voices drifted down through the barn, voices that definitely didn't belong to anyone they knew. "Shit," Jake whispered, grabbing the logbook and shoving it inside his jacket. "How fast can you climb?" The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Jake spread another manila folder across the concrete floor. His hands trembled slightly as he photographed each document with his phone, the camera flash illuminating decades-old secrets in stark white bursts. Beside him, Marcus worked methodically through a metal filing cabinet, his usual jokes replaced by grim silence. "Jake, look at this." Marcus's voice cracked as he held up a photograph. The black and white image showed their grandfather as a young man, maybe 30, standing next to a woman they didn't recognize. Both wore serious expressions, and in the background loomed the familiar silhouette of their family's farmhouse. Jake squinted at the photo. "Who's the woman?" "That's what worries me." Marcus flipped the photograph over. Written in faded blue ink were the words, "R. Henderson and Agent Sarah Chen, Operation Meadowlark, June 1973. Agent." The word hung between them like a loaded gun. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Emma, asking if they were okay. He'd forgotten they'd been down here for over 3 hours. The outside world felt impossibly distant now, separated from them by layers of earth and lies that stretched back 50 years. "We need to call someone," Jake said, though even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't sure who that someone would be. "The local sheriff? The FBI? How do you report discovering that your dead grandfather might have been involved in classified government operations?" Marcus pulled out another file, this one stamped with red letters, "Eyes Only, Level 7 Clearance." Inside were satellite photographs of locations Jake didn't recognize, along with detailed reports about something called Asset Recovery Protocol. The technical language was dense, but certain phrases jumped out. National security threat, terminated with extreme prejudice. Plausible deniability maintained. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered. Grandpa wasn't just storing documents, he was part of whatever this was. Jake felt sick. Their grandfather had been the kindest man they'd ever known, the type who saved injured birds and never raised his voice, even when they'd accidentally driven his tractor through the fence. The idea that he'd been involved in government operations that apparently included killing people seemed impossible. A new folder caught Jake's attention. Unlike the others, this one bore their grandfather's handwriting on the tab, Insurance. Inside, Robert Henderson had meticulously documented names, dates, and locations. His neat script detailed meetings with government officials, payments received, and most chilling of all, a list of people who had been permanently silenced when they threatened to expose Operation Meadowlark. He was documenting everything, Jake realized. This wasn't just storage, he was building a case. Marcus found a letter addressed to my grandsons paper-clipped to the inside of the insurance folder. Their grandfather's familiar handwriting looked shaky, as if he'd been ill when he wrote it. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've found what I've spent 40 years trying to forget. I was young and stupid and believed I was serving my country. By the time I understood what we were really doing, I was in too deep to walk away. They told us we were protecting America from internal threats. What we were really doing was eliminating anyone who asked the wrong questions about government funding and illegal operations. I kept these documents because I knew that someday someone would need proof. The men who ran Operation Meadowlark are still alive, still powerful, still willing to kill to protect their secrets. Sarah Chen tried to expose them in 1974. They made it look like a car accident. If anyone comes asking about me or these documents, you need to be very careful. Trust no one in law enforcement until you know which side they're on. Contact investigative journalist David Walsh at the Washington Herald. He's been trying to uncover this story for years. Give him everything. I'm sorry to burden you with this. I should have been braver when I was younger. Don't make my mistakes. All my love, Grandpa." The brothers sat in stunned silence. Outside they could hear Emma calling their names, her voice growing more concerned. But down in the bunker, surrounded by evidence of their grandfather's secret life, the normal world felt like something from a dream. "We can't tell Emma," Marcus said finally. "Not yet. The fewer people who know about this, the better." Jake nodded, though part of him rebelled against keeping secrets from the woman he loved. But his grandfather's warning echoed in his mind. Anyone who asked the wrong questions about government funding and illegal operations had been eliminated. Marcus began carefully organizing the most damning documents into a separate pile. "We photograph everything first, then we decide what to do with the originals." As Jake continued documenting their grandfather's secrets, one thought kept repeating in his mind. If the people behind Operation Meadowlark were still alive and still powerful, then he and Marcus had just painted targets on their backs. The question was whether they'd realize it in time to survive what came next. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Jake spread another manila folder across the concrete floor. His hands trembled slightly as he photographed each document with his phone, the camera flash illuminating decades-old typewritten pages that should never have existed on a family farm in rural Iowa. "This is insane," Marcus whispered, crouched beside a filing cabinet marked Operation Nightshade, eyes only. He held up a photograph of their grandfather shaking hands with a man in a dark suit outside what looked like the very barn they'd broken into hours earlier. Grandpa Joe was CIA? Jake squinted at the photo. Their grandfather looked younger, maybe in his 40s, wearing the same flannel shirts and work boots they remembered, but his posture was different. Confident, alert, nothing like the gentle farmer who'd taught them to milk cows and fix tractors. "Turkis!" Marcus opened another folder, revealing surveillance photographs of the surrounding farms, each marked with detailed notes about the neighbors' daily routines, the Kowalskis' morning chores, old Mrs. Chen's weekly trips to town, even the mail carrier's schedule, documented down to the minute. Jake's stomach turned as he realized the scope of whatever had happened here. He was watching everyone. For how long? A loose document caught his attention, a hand-drawn map of the underground tunnel system. His blood ran cold as he traced the routes with his finger. The tunnels didn't just run under their property. They extended beneath 3 neighboring farms, with marked access points disguised as root cellars and storm shelters. "Marcus, we need to see this." Jake held up the map, pointing to a notation in red ink. "Emergency evacuation route to Highway 6, 2.3 miles. But Marcus wasn't listening. He stood frozen in front of an open filing cabinet, holding a thick folder marked termination protocols. His face had gone pale. "What is it?" Marcus's voice came out as barely a whisper. "There's a list here, names and addresses. Some of them are crossed out in red." He swallowed hard. "The Kowalskis are on here. They disappeared in 1978, remember? Mom always said they just moved away suddenly." Jake grabbed the folder, scanning the typewritten names. 12 families total, all former neighbors. Most had red lines through them, with dates and brief notations: relocated, security breach, neutralized, excessive curiosity, eliminated, direct threat. The Henderson family name appeared at the bottom of the list, but with a different notation: asset family, maintain cover at all costs. "We weren't just living here," Jake said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. We were part of it. The whole family was part of whatever this was. A metal footlocker in the corner caught Marcus's attention. Inside, they found equipment that definitely didn't belong on a farm: sophisticated radio gear, encryption devices, and what looked like surveillance equipment from the 1970s. Beneath the electronics, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay 3 handguns and boxes of ammunition. Jake picked up one of the radios, surprised by its weight. A piece of paper taped to the bottom showed frequency codes and call signs. One entry made his hands shake: Shepherd Base, 141.250, Joseph Henderson, Agent 247. Agent 247, Marcus repeated. Jesus, Jake. Grandpa was a federal agent. For how long? Since before Dad was born. Before Jake could answer, Marcus found another folder that made them both freeze. It contained birth certificates, social security cards, and school records, all for Joseph Henderson, but with 3 different birth dates and places of birth. "Which one is real?" Marcus asked. Jake was studying a document that looked like a mission briefing when he noticed the date: September 15th, 1979. The same month their father had been born. According to the briefing, Joseph Henderson was supposed to maintain his cover identity for indefinite duration while monitoring Soviet agricultural intelligence activities in the Midwest. "Soviet spies," Jake said aloud. "They were tracking Soviet spies using our farm as a base." Marcus had moved to another section of the bunker, where maps of the entire county covered one wall. Red pins marked dozens of locations, connected by string like some conspiracy theorist's fever dream. But this wasn't theory. This was operational intelligence, complete with photographs and detailed surveillance notes. "Look at this," Marcus called out, pointing to a large red X marked over what Jake recognized as the old Kowalski property. A notation beside it read, "Infiltration confirmed. Family eliminated October 12, 1978. Cover story, relocation to California." The word eliminated hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Jake's phone buzzed with a text message, making them both jump. It was from Sarah. "Heard you boys were poking around the old barn. Might want to be more careful. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." They stared at the message, then at each other. Neither of them had told Sarah about breaking into the barn. "How does she know?" Marcus whispered. Jake was already moving toward the ladder, his heart pounding. "Because she's watching us." The flickering fluorescent light cast eerie shadows across the concrete walls as Marcus spread another stack of documents across the metal table. His hands trembled slightly, not from the underground chill, but from what he'd been reading for the past 2 hours. Each file painted a more disturbing picture than the last. "Jake, you need to see this," Marcus called, his voice echoing in the confined space. Jake looked up from the corner where he'd been examining a collection of surveillance equipment. More experimental stuff? Worse. Marcus held up a manila folder marked with red stamps. "This one's about our town, specifically." Jake abandoned the cameras and joined his brother at the table. The folder contained detailed maps of Millbrook, annotated with red circles around various locations: the elementary school, the water treatment plant, Dr. Kellerman's old clinic on Main Street. Even their own farm was marked, with neat handwriting noting primary operations base, clearance level 7 required. "Operations base for what?" Jake whispered. Marcus flipped to the next page, revealing a document titled Project Mindbridge, Phase 3 Implementation. The text below made Jake's blood run cold. The project involved introducing experimental compounds into the local water supply, monitoring behavioral changes in the population, and documenting psychological effects over extended periods. They were using our entire town as a lab, Marcus said, his voice barely audible. Look at the dates. This went on for almost 6 years. Jake scanned the clinical notes, feeling sick. Increased aggression levels in test subjects, memory gaps, unexplained episodes of disorientation. He thought about old Mrs. Patterson, who used to wander around town talking to people who weren't there, about Tommy Reeves, who'd had that violent breakdown in high school that no one could explain, about his own father's strange mood swings during those years. The water supply, Jake said suddenly. Remember when Dad used to make us drink only from the well? He said the town water tasted funny. Marcus nodded slowly. He knew. Somehow he knew. A new fear crept into Jake's mind. If Grandpa was involved in this, and Dad found out, you think that's why they never spoke? Marcus finished the thought. Why Dad seemed so angry whenever Grandpa's name came up? Before Jake could answer, they heard it, the distant rumble of a vehicle engine approaching the farm. Both brothers froze, listening. The engine grew louder, then stopped somewhere near the house. Could be anyone, Jake whispered, but his instincts screamed otherwise. They'd been down here too long, completely absorbed in the documents. Someone could have been watching, waiting. Marcus quickly began gathering the most damning files. We need to get some of these out of here. Evidence. Jake moved to the surveillance monitors they'd discovered earlier. Most showed static, but one displayed a grainy view of their farmhouse. A black SUV sat in the driveway, and 2 figures in dark clothing were approaching the front door. Company, Jake announced grimly. They could hear footsteps above now, heavy boots walking through the house. The men weren't trying to be quiet. They knew no one was supposed to be home. Jake and Marcus had told everyone they were going to the county fair, a convenient lie that now felt like a death sentence. Is there another way out? Marcus asked, scanning the bunker's walls. Jake examined the space more carefully. In the far corner, partially hidden behind filing cabinets, he spotted what looked like a ventilation shaft. It was narrow, but they might fit. Maybe. But we can't take much. Marcus stuffed the most crucial documents inside his jacket. The Project Mindbridge files, the town maps, and a personnel roster that included names they recognized, local officials, business owners, people still living in Millbrook. The footsteps above grew more frantic, doors slamming, furniture being moved. The searchers were being thorough. Jake removed the grate from the ventilation shaft and peered inside. It extended into darkness, but he could feel air movement. I think this connects to the old root cellar on the hill. Grandpa showed it to us when we were kids, remember? Marcus nodded. The root cellar was about 200 yards from the house, hidden among a grove of oak trees. If they could reach it without being seen, they might have a chance. You go first, Jake whispered. I'll replace the grate behind us and try to make it look undisturbed. Marcus squeezed into the shaft, the documents crackling softly against his jacket. Jake took one last look at the bunker. Decades of secrets that powerful people had killed to protect. Their grandfather had been part of something monstrous, and now that legacy was hunting them. As he pulled the grate back into place, Jake heard new sounds from above. More vehicles, more voices. Whatever they'd stumbled into was bigger than they'd imagined, and the people responsible had no intention of letting the Henderson brothers walk away with the truth. The shaft was cramped and pitch black, but it was their only chance of survival. The fluorescent lights in the bunker cast harsh shadows across Jake's face as he rifled through another box of documents. 3 days had passed since their discovery, and the weight of what they'd found pressed down on both brothers like a physical force. Sleep had become elusive, interrupted by every creaking floorboard and rustling tree branch outside their farmhouse windows. Listen to this, Jake said, his voice hoarse from hours of reading aloud. He held up a manila folder marked with red stamps. Project Starfall. They were using our property as a staging ground for something called domestic intelligence operations, whatever the hell that means. Marcus looked up from the metal filing cabinet he'd been examining. It means they were spying on Americans, our neighbors probably, maybe even our own family. He pulled out a thick binder and flipped it open. There's a whole section here about surveillance protocols for the surrounding counties, names, addresses, suspected affiliations. The bunker felt smaller with each passing hour. What had initially seemed like a treasure trove of historical secrets now felt more like a tomb filled with dangerous knowledge. The air recycling system hummed constantly, but somehow the space still felt suffocating. Jake's phone buzzed against the concrete floor where he'd set it. The screen showed an unknown number with a local area code. He stared at it for 3 rings before answering. "Hello?" Silence stretched across the line, broken only by the faint sound of breathing. "We know what you found." The voice was electronically distorted, neither clearly male nor female. Some secrets should stay buried. The line went dead. Jake's hand trembled as he lowered the phone. "Who was it?" Marcus asked, though the expression on his brother's face had already provided the answer. "Someone who knows about this place." Jake gestured around the bunker. "We need to get out of here, now." They began stuffing the most important documents into backpacks, their movements quick and urgent. Marcus grabbed files labeled with their grandfather's name, while Jake focused on anything marked with the highest security classifications. The weight of paper and paranoia filled their bags equally. As they climbed the ladder back to the barn, Marcus caught sight of headlights sweeping across the dirt road leading to their property. 2 vehicles moving slowly, deliberately, not the casual pace of lost tourists or neighbors dropping by for a visit. "Kill the lights," he whispered to Jake, who immediately doused the single bulb hanging from the barn's rafters. They pressed themselves against the barn walls, peering through gaps in the weathered wood. The vehicles stopped at the property's edge, engines idling. Dark sedans that looked government-issued, with tinted windows that reflected the moonlight like obsidian mirrors. 4 figures emerged, moving with military precision across the farmyard. They wore dark clothing and carried what appeared to be equipment cases. One gestured toward the barn while speaking into a radio device. The back exit, Marcus breathed into Jake's ear, through the cornfield. They slipped out through a loose board in the barn's rear wall, backpacks clutched tight against their bodies. The tall corn provided cover, but every step seemed to crackle like gunshots in the night air. Behind them, they could hear the barn door sliding open and the murmur of voices. The brothers moved through the field with practiced ease, following paths they'd known since childhood. The corn maze that had once been their playground now served as their escape route from whoever was systematically searching their grandfather's property. When they finally reached the edge of the field, they could see lights moving inside the barn. Flashlight beams swept back and forth in organized patterns. Professional searchers who knew exactly what they were looking for. "The old hunting cabin," Jake whispered. "Dad's place up by Miller's Creek." It was a 20-minute hike through dense woods, but the cabin would provide temporary shelter and a place to examine what they'd salvaged from the bunker. More importantly, it had no connection to their family's official property records. Their father had built it years ago on abandoned state land, a technically illegal structure that had never appeared on any government maps. As they made their way through the darkness, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they'd crossed a line from which there was no return. Whatever their grandfather had been involved in during the 1970s, it clearly involved people who still had power, still had resources, and still considered the information worth protecting. The documents in their backpacks felt heavier with each step. They contained names, dates, operational details of government activities that someone had spent decades keeping secret. And now, 2 farmers from rural America held proof of conspiracies that reached into the highest levels of power. The hunting cabin emerged from the tree line like a dark sanctuary. No lights followed them through the forest, but both brothers knew their problems were just beginning. Tomorrow they would have to decide what to do with knowledge that people were willing to kill for. The manila envelope felt heavy in Jake's hands as he spread its contents across the kitchen table. Black and white photographs scattered like fallen leaves, each one a window into a past that shouldn't exist. Marcus leaned over his shoulder, breathing hard as they both stared at the impossible images before them. "That's Grandpa Joe," Marcus whispered, pointing to a figure in the center of one photograph. Their grandfather stood younger and straighter than they'd ever known him, wearing a crisp military uniform they'd never seen. He was shaking hands with men in dark suits outside what looked like a government building. Jake picked up another photo. Same grandfather, different setting. This time he stood beside a woman with severe features and calculating eyes, both of them flanked by soldiers. A stamp on the back read, "Project Blackwood, classified." "Project Blackwood," Jake read aloud. "What the hell is Project Blackwood?" Marcus was already rifling through the other documents they'd brought up from the bunker. His hands shook as he unfolded a thick folder marked with red stamps. "Jake, look at this." The document was a personnel file. Joseph Henderson, their grandfather, listed as asset coordinator for something called the Rural Intelligence Network. The description made Jake's stomach drop, establishing covert communication hubs and safe houses across agricultural communities in the Midwest, 1971 to 1979. "Safe houses," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Our farm was a safe house." Jake flipped through more pages, finding maps of their county with red X marks scattered across family farms they recognized. The Petersons' place down the road had a 10th, so did the old Kowalski farm that had been abandoned since they were kids. At least a dozen properties, all marked, all connected by thin red lines that formed a web across the rural landscape. "Oh my God," Jake breathed. "It's a whole network." They weren't just using Grandpa Joe's farm. They had the whole county wired. A loose photograph slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. Marcus bent to retrieve it, then froze. "Jake, you need to see this." The photo showed their grandfather standing beside a man they both recognized immediately, despite his younger face and different haircut. Senator Richard Cartwright, the man currently running for president, the same man whose campaign office they'd seen on the news just that morning, stood with their grandfather in what appeared to be the very barn they'd broken into yesterday. Behind them, barely visible in the background, was the entrance to the underground bunker. "Cartwright knows," Marcus said. "He's been here. He knows about everything down there." Jake grabbed his laptop and pulled up news articles about Cartwright's campaign. The man's biography listed his early career as national security consulting in the 1970s, deliberately vague about specifics. Now they knew why. "Look at the dates," Jake said, comparing the photographs to the timeline of Cartwright's public career. He would have been, what, mid-20s? Just starting out. This could be how he made his connections, how he built his political career. Marcus found another folder, this one containing financial records, payments made to agricultural consultants across the Midwest, including substantial monthly sums paid to their grandfather. The amounts were staggering for the 1970s, enough to explain how their family had managed to keep the farm running during some of the worst agricultural years in the state's history. "We always wondered how Grandpa Joe kept this place afloat," Marcus said. "Dad used to say he was just lucky with his crops, but the neighbors were all struggling. Now we know why." Jake's phone buzzed with a text message. His blood ran cold as he read it. "We know you found it. Cartwright Campaign Headquarters, 8 p.m. tonight. Come alone, bring nothing. Your family's safety depends on your discretion." Marcus read the message over his shoulder. "How do they even have your number?" "I don't know, but they know we were in the bunker. They're watching us." Jake looked out the kitchen window at the empty field stretching toward the horizon. Suddenly, the familiar landscape felt hostile, full of hidden eyes and unseen threats. "We can't go," Marcus said. "It's obviously a trap." "And if we don't go?" They already threatened the family. Mom and Dad are in Florida, completely unaware. Sarah's in college. They could get to any of them. Marcus paced the small kitchen, running his hands through his hair. "So what do we do? Just walk into whatever they have planned?" Jake looked down at the photographs spread across the table, at their grandfather's younger face staring back at them from a past full of secrets and lies. "No," he said finally. "We go, but not alone and not empty-handed. If they want to talk about keeping secrets buried, they need to understand that we're not the same naive farm boys who walked into that barn yesterday." He began gathering the documents, his movements deliberate and determined. It's time to find out exactly who killed Grandpa Joe and why. The safe house felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. Marcus had driven them 20 miles north to an abandoned ranger station nestled deep in the Cascade foothills where towering pines blocked most of the afternoon light. The building's weathered logs and broken windows gave it the appearance of a place the world had forgotten, which, Marcus assured them, was exactly the point. Jake sat on a dusty cot, his hands still trembling as he thumbed through one of the documents they'd managed to grab before fleeing the farm. The pages detailed something called Project Clearwater, a joint CIA military operation that had used their grandfather's property as a staging ground for covert experiments. The more he read, the more his stomach churned. Psychological warfare testing, he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Human subjects recruited from local communities under false pretenses. He looked up at Tommy, who was pacing near the boarded window. "These aren't just documents, Tommy. They're evidence of war crimes." Marcus emerged from the back room, a satellite phone pressed to his ear. His expression had grown increasingly grim with each conversation. "We've got a problem," he said, ending the call. "3 of my contacts have gone dark in the last 2 hours. Someone's cleaning house." Tommy stopped pacing. "What does that mean for us?" "It means we're not just dealing with a cover-up anymore. This is active damage control." Marcus pulled a chair closer to the brothers. "I need you to understand something. The people behind Project Clearwater aren't retired bureaucrats worried about their pensions. Some of them are still in positions of power, senators, defense contractors, intelligence officials. This bunker wasn't just storage. It was an insurance policy." Jake felt the blood drain from his face. Our grandfather was blackmailing them. Smart man. As long as he kept quiet and the evidence stayed buried, everyone maintained their comfortable lives. But now that it's exposed, Marcus trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air. The satellite phone buzzed. Marcus answered with a curt, "Yeah?" His face darkened as he listened. "How long ago?" "Understood." He hung up and immediately began gathering gear from a nearby duffel bag. "We're moving." "Now, what happened?" Tommy demanded. "They found the ranger who helped me get you out of town. He's alive, but barely. They're working their way through my network faster than I anticipated." Jake's chest tightened. "This is because of us. People are getting hurt because we opened that damn bunker." Marcus stopped packing and fixed Jake with a steady stare. "No. People are getting hurt because powerful men committed terrible crimes and have spent 40 years ensuring they'd never face consequences. You didn't create this mess. You just uncovered it." A distant sound made all 3 men freeze, vehicle engines growing closer. Marcus moved to the window and peered through a gap in the boards. 2 black SUVs, maybe 300 yards out. He shouldered his pack and tossed another to Tommy. "There's a trail behind the station that leads to a creek bed. Follow it downstream for half a mile, then head northeast until you hit Highway 9. "What about you?" Tommy asked. "I'm going to buy you time and see if I can thin their numbers." Marcus handed Jake a small device that looked like a modified GPS unit. "This will get you to another safe house. The address is already programmed in." Jake stared at the device, feeling completely out of his depth. "We don't know how to do this, Marcus. We're farmers, not spies. You're survivors. And right now, that's what matters." The engine sounds grew louder. "Listen to me carefully. There's a journalist in Seattle named Diana Thornfield. She's been investigating government black sites for years. If something happens to me, get those documents to her. She'll know what to do with them." Tommy grabbed Marcus's arm. "Don't do anything stupid. Sarah's pregnant. Those documents aren't worth your life." Marcus smiled grimly. "Maybe not, but the truth they contain might be worth all of ours." He checked his weapon and moved toward the front door. "Go. Stay off main roads, pay cash for everything, and trust no one in uniform until you reach Diana." The brothers slipped out the back as the first SUV pulled into the clearing. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as they jogged toward the tree line, the weight of the document bag pulling at his shoulder. Behind them, he heard car doors slamming and voices shouting orders. They'd barely reached the cover of the pines when the first gunshot echoed through the forest. Tommy grabbed Jake's arm, urging him to move faster, but Jake found himself looking back toward the ranger station. Through the trees he could see dark figures surrounding the building. More gunshots followed, and Jake realized with crystal clarity that their old life was truly over. There would be no going back to the farm, no returning to the simple existence they'd known just days ago. They were fugitives now, carrying secrets that powerful people would kill for. The creek bed lay ahead, offering the promise of escape and the terrifying uncertainty of what came next. The black sedan had been parked across from Miller's diner for 3 hours, its occupants rotating shifts like clockwork. Jake watched from behind the cracked Venetian blinds of their motel room as another figure slumped down in the passenger seat, relieving the previous watcher. These weren't amateurs. "They're not even trying to hide anymore," Marcus said, pacing the narrow space between the two beds. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually steady hands trembled as he rifled through the photocopied documents for the 100th time. "It's like they want us to know we're trapped." Jake let the blinds snap shut and turned back to the room. The documents were spread across every surface: bed, dresser, even the bathroom counter. Pages of correspondence between their grandfather and someone identified only as Control. Technical specifications for something called Project Blackwater, financial records showing massive fund transfers to shell companies, and most disturbing of all, a list of names under the heading Operational Casualties with dates spanning from 1971 to 1978. "Look at this again," Marcus said, holding up a memo dated October 15, 1974. Grandfather wasn't just storing these documents, he was actively involved in whatever this was. Jake read over his brother's shoulder. The memo detailed concerns about civilian exposure risks and recommended immediate relocation of primary assets. It was signed with their grandfather's full name, Edgar William Henderson, followed by a designation neither brother recognized: Deputy Operations Coordinator, Northern District. "Deputy Operations Coordinator," Jake repeated slowly. The man who taught us to fish and fix tractors was some kind of government spook? A sharp knock at the door froze them both. Jake motioned for Marcus to gather the documents while he crept toward the window. The black sedan was still there, both occupants visible inside. "So who was at their door?" "Housekeeping," came a muffled female voice. Jake checked his watch. Nearly midnight. He caught Marcus's eye and shook his head. They'd learned to trust their instincts since fleeing the farm, and right now every instinct screamed danger. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "I have clean towels." Marcus had already started shoving documents into their backpack. Jake grabbed his jacket and moved toward the bathroom window they'd checked earlier, their planned escape route if things went sideways. The window overlooked an alley that connected to a drainage ditch running behind the motel. "Room service," the voice tried again, dropping the housekeeping pretense. Definitely not the night clerk's voice they'd heard earlier. Jake was halfway through the bathroom window when the door exploded inward. Wood splinters flew across the room as two figures in tactical gear rushed inside, weapons drawn. Marcus dove behind the far bed, clutching the backpack to his chest. "Are the documents." The lead figure's voice was calm, professional. No mask, which worried Jake more than if they'd been concealing their faces. People who didn't bother hiding their identity weren't planning to leave witnesses. Jake dropped silently into the alley below, his boots splashing in a puddle of questionable origin. Through the window, he could see Marcus pressed against the wall, the backpack's strap cutting into his shoulder as he held it protectively. "I asked you a question," the operative said, stepping closer to Marcus. "We know you took classified materials from the Henderson property. Those documents belong to the United States government." "Funny how they belonged to our grandfather for 40 years, Marcus shot back, surprising Jake with his defiance. "Maybe you should have asked for them back before he died." The operative's partner moved to check the bathroom, and Jake pressed himself against the motel's exterior wall. Any second now, they'd discover the open window and his escape route would be compromised. Your grandfather was a patriot who understood the importance of national security, the lead operative continued. He kept those documents safe because he knew what would happen if they fell into the wrong hands. You boys are in way over your heads. Jake crept along the alley toward the front of the building, staying low beneath the windows. He needed to create a distraction, something that would give Marcus a chance to escape with the documents. The black sedan's engine was running, probably their backup transportation. As he reached the corner of the building, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. A third figure was positioned near the motel office, effectively cutting off any escape route toward the main road. They weren't just here to retrieve the documents, they were here to clean up loose ends permanently. Inside the room, he heard Marcus cry out in pain. The sound galvanized Jake into action. He picked up a chunk of broken concrete from the alley and hurled it at the sedan's windshield. The safety glass spiderwebbed with a satisfying crack, and the car's alarm began shrieking into the night. The distraction lasted exactly long enough for Marcus to bolt through the bathroom window, landing hard beside Jake in the alley. Together, they ran toward the drainage ditch, the backpack bouncing between them as shouts erupted from the motel room behind them. Their grandfather's secrets had already cost them their home and their safety. Jake was beginning to suspect the price would only get higher. The silence stretched between Jake and Marcus as they sat in the farmhouse kitchen, the weight of their discovery pressing down like a physical force. The classified documents lay spread across the wooden table, reports about mind control experiments, coded correspondence between government agencies, and photographs that made Jake's stomach turn. Their grandfather's handwriting filled the margins of several papers, notes that revealed William Henderson hadn't just been an unwilling participant in Project Mindbridge. He'd been documenting everything. "Listen to this," Marcus said, his voice hoarse from hours of reading. He held up a letter dated March 15, 1973. It's from someone called Shepard to Grandpa. "William, the subjects in Group C are showing concerning side effects. Dr. Kellerman insists we continue, but I fear we've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. The children especially—" Jesus, Jake, they were experimenting on kids. Jake pushed back from the table, pacing to the window. The morning sun cast long shadows across the fields where he'd played as a child, where he'd thought he understood his family's history. Now every memory felt contaminated. "We need to figure out who Shepard was. And this Dr. Kellerman, his name keeps appearing everywhere." A car engine rumbled up the gravel driveway, and both brothers froze. Through the lace curtains, Jake watched a black sedan approach, the same model that had been following them for days. His blood went cold as he recognized the driver, Agent Sarah Chen, the woman who'd claimed to be from the EPA. "They found us," he whispered. Marcus was already gathering the most incriminating documents. "The root cellar. We can hide these with the others." But there wasn't time. Chen's footsteps were already on the porch, followed by heavier boots, at least 2 other people. Jake shoved the papers into a flour canister while Marcus grabbed his grandfather's journal. The knock came firm and authoritative. "Mr. Henderson, this is Agent Chen. We need to speak with you." Jake opened the door before they could break it down. Chen stood flanked by 2 men in dark suits, their faces carved from stone. Her earlier pretense of environmental concern had vanished, replaced by cold efficiency. "May we come in?" she asked, though she was already stepping over the threshold. "Do we have a choice?" Jake stepped aside, noting how the men's eyes swept the room, cataloging everything. Chen moved directly to the kitchen table where flour dust marked where the documents had been. "You've been busy. Where are they? Where's what?" Marcus emerged from the hallway, his hands conspicuously empty. One of the suits, a man with silver hair and dead eyes, spoke for the first time. "Mr. Henderson, my name is Coleman. I work for people who take national security very seriously. Your grandfather signed agreements that extend beyond his death, agreements that make possession of certain materials a federal crime." Jake felt his temper flare. "Our grandfather was tortured by your people. We found the medical reports, the drugs, the psychological manipulation. And you're worried about paperwork?" Coleman's expression didn't change. Your grandfather volunteered for important research that helped protect this country during a critical period. Any unfortunate side effects were regrettable but necessary. Necessary? Marcus stepped forward, and Jake saw the same rage in his brother's eyes that he felt building in his chest. He spent 40 years afraid of his own shadow, jumped at every unexpected sound, couldn't sleep without checking the locks 3 times. You destroyed him. What we did, Chen interjected, was classified then and remains classified now. Which brings us to why we're here. Those documents need to be returned, all of them. And you need to understand that discussing this situation with anyone, family, friends, media, law enforcement, would be considered an act of treason. Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. Are you threatening us? Coleman reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila envelope. We prefer to think of it as clarifying the situation. He placed the envelope on the table. Inside you'll find detailed background checks on both of you, as well as your families. Marcus, your daughter Emma, attends Jefferson Elementary, walks to school every day down Maple Street. Jake, your ex-wife Sarah works late shifts at Memorial Hospital. Parking garage can be dangerous at night. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jake's hands clenched into fists. If you touch them... We don't want to touch anyone, Chen said smoothly. We want this situation resolved quietly. Return the documents. Sign a few papers confirming you understand your obligations under various national security acts, and everyone goes back to their normal lives. Marcus moved toward the window, and Jake caught his brother's slight nod toward the barn. The signal was subtle, but Jake understood. They hadn't found everything yet. And if we refuse? Jake asked, buying time. Coleman smiled, and it was like watching a shark bare its teeth. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. We'll give you until tomorrow evening to consider our generous offer. After that, he shrugged. Accidents happen, people disappear. Sometimes entire families just relocate unexpectedly. The 3 agents moved toward the door with practiced coordination. Chen paused at the threshold. Your grandfather was smart enough to know when he was beaten, gentlemen. I suggest you follow his example. The black sedan had been parked at the end of Millfield Road for 3 hours, its occupants watching the Henderson farm through high-powered binoculars. Jake spotted it first from the kitchen window, his blood turning to ice as he recognized the same make and model that had followed them from the library. They're not even trying to hide anymore, Marcus whispered, peering through the crack in the curtains. The 2 figures in the car sat motionless, professional in their stillness. Sarah paced the living room, clutching her laptop bag. We need to get these files to Agent Morrison now. Every minute we wait gives them more time to... The landline's shrill ring cut through her words. They all froze, staring at the old rotary phone on the hall table. Jake's hand trembled as he lifted the receiver. Mr. Henderson? The voice was calm, measured. My name is Director Collins. I believe you and your brother have found something that belongs to the United States government. I don't know what you're talking about, Jake managed, though his voice cracked. Please don't insult my intelligence. We have satellite imagery of your activities in the barn. We know about the bunker. We also know you've been sharing classified information with unauthorized personnel. The pause that followed felt heavy with threat. However, we're prepared to be reasonable. Marcus grabbed the phone. Reasonable? Like you were reasonable when you murdered our grandfather? Colin's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. Your grandfather died of natural causes, Mr. Henderson, though I understand grief can make people imaginative. Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to gather every document, every photograph, every scrap of paper from that bunker, and you're going to bring it to the old grain elevator on Highway 9. Come alone, both of you. And if we refuse? Marcus's knuckles were white around the receiver. Then the unfortunate gas leak that's about to occur at your property will be truly tragic. We've already identified the faulty line running beneath your house. The line went dead. Through the window, they could see one of the men in the sedan speaking into a radio. Sarah's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard. I'm uploading everything to a secure server right now. Cloud storage, encrypted. If something happens to us, nothing's going to happen, Jake said, though he didn't believe his own words. He was thinking of their grandfather's journal. The entry about how the project had consumed good men turned them into something else. But we need a backup plan. 20 minutes later, Marcus drove the old pickup truck down the gravel driveway, a canvas bag filled with decoy documents in the passenger seat. The real files were hidden in the false bottom of the truck bed, covered by hay bales and farm equipment. Jake had insisted on going alone, but Marcus refused to let his younger brother face this without backup. The grain elevator loomed against the grey sky like a concrete monument to better times. Collins was waiting in the shadow of the structure, flanked by two men in dark suits. He was older than his voice had suggested, with silver hair and the kind of face that belonged in corporate boardrooms rather than abandoned grain facilities. "Mr. Henderson, I appreciate your cooperation." Collins gestured to the bag. "I trust everything is there?" Marcus hefted the canvas bag but didn't hand it over. "First, I want answers. What was Project Mockingbird really about? What was worth destroying our grandfather's life?" Collins studied him with the patience of a man accustomed to holding all the cards. "Your grandfather volunteered for something greater than himself. The Cold War required sacrifices. Sometimes good people had to do terrible things to protect the American way of life." "Bullshit." Marcus's voice carried across the empty lot. "He was tortured, brainwashed. You turned him into a weapon and then buried him on a farm when you were done with him. The program produced remarkable results. Your grandfather's contributions helped prevent nuclear war, Mr. Henderson. Show some gratitude." One of Collins' men stepped forward, his hand moving inside his jacket. Marcus tensed, calculating distances, escape routes. The bag felt impossibly heavy in his grip. That's when the first gunshot rang out from the tree line. Collins spun, barking orders into his radio as chaos erupted around the grain elevator. More shots followed, and Marcus realized this wasn't random violence. This was coordinated. Someone else wanted those documents. He dove behind an old piece of farm equipment as bullets pinged off metal and concrete. Collins and his men had taken cover behind their vehicles, returning fire toward the woods. In the confusion, Marcus spotted movement near the back of the elevator. Jake, clutching the real files, using the firefighters' cover to reach the extraction point they'd planned. But as Marcus watched his brother sprint across the open ground, a third group emerged from the shadows of the grain elevator itself. These weren't government agents or mysterious shooters from the woods. These were the people their grandfather had written about in his final entries, the ones who'd never stopped watching, never stopped waiting for the truth to surface. The conspiracy had more players than they'd ever imagined. The safe house felt like a tomb. Jake pressed his back against the cold concrete wall, listening to the rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the darkness. 12 hours had passed since Agent Morrison's encrypted message arrived, warning them that their location had been compromised. 12 hours of waiting for extraction that never came. "We should never have trusted him," Danny whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation system. His fingers traced the edge of one of the classified documents they'd managed to salvage from the bunker. Even in the dim emergency lighting, Jake could see the deep circles under his brother's eyes. The document spread across the metal table told a story more horrifying than either brother had imagined. Operation Nightfall wasn't just about mind control experiments or illegal surveillance. The papers detailed a systematic program to eliminate American citizens who posed threats to national security, people who had stumbled onto classified information, journalists asking the wrong questions, researchers getting too close to the truth. Their grandfather hadn't been protecting government secrets. He'd been documenting them. Jake picked up a photograph that had haunted him since they'd found it. A young man in military fatigues stood beside their grandfather, both men grinning at the camera. The date stamp read 1973. On the back, someone had written before everything went wrong. "RM, RM," Jake muttered, studying the faded ink. "Morrison's initials are RM." Danny's head snapped up. "What?" Richard Morrison. Look at this picture again. Jake held it under the light. The young soldier's face, decades younger, but unmistakably familiar. The same sharp jawline, the same intense eyes they'd seen in the government agent who claimed to be helping them. Jesus Christ! Danny grabbed the photograph. Morrison's been involved since the beginning. He knew Grandpa. The realization hit them both simultaneously. Morrison hadn't appeared to help them. He'd been watching, waiting to see what they'd discovered. Every document they'd shared with him, every location they'd revealed, had been feeding information back to the very people who wanted them dead. A metallic clang echoed through the bunker. Both brothers froze. Jake motioned for Danny to kill the lights. They plunged into absolute darkness, hearts hammering in the silence. Another sound, footsteps on metal stairs, careful and deliberate. "Henderson, boys!" a familiar voice called out. Morrison's voice, but different now. The friendly facade was gone, replaced by something cold and authoritative. "I know you're down there. We need to talk." Jake's hand found the pistol Morrison had given him for protection. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Funny thing about your grandfather," Morrison continued, his footsteps growing closer. "He was supposed to destroy those documents 40 years ago. Instead, he got sentimental, thought the world deserved to know the truth about what we did in the name of freedom." Danny pressed against Jake in the darkness. They could hear at least 3 sets of footsteps now. He paid for that mistake. Car accident on a rainy night. Except it wasn't raining, was it? And those brakes had been working fine the day before. Morrison's laugh echoed off the concrete walls. "We thought the secret died with him. Imagine our surprise when his grandsons decided to play archaeology." Jake felt Danny tense beside him. Their grandfather's death had never made sense. The police report mentioned brake failure, but Jake remembered Grandpa checking his truck obsessively, maintaining it like his life depended on it. "You killed him," Danny's voice cracked as he spoke. "We eliminated a security risk," Morrison replied matter-of-factly. "Just like we eliminated Dr. Sarah Chen when she got too curious about her research being weaponized. Just like we eliminated every journalist and researcher whose name appears in those files you've been reading." The documents suddenly made horrifying sense. The lists of names, the dates, the coded references they'd dismissed as bureaucratic jargon. They were death certificates, disguised as operational reports. "The question is," Morrison continued, "whether you boys are going to be reasonable about this. There are forces bigger than you can imagine at work here. Forces that have kept this country safe for decades by making the hard choices others won't make." Jake's finger found the pistol's safety. In the darkness, he could barely make out the emergency exit Danny had located during their initial sweep of the bunker, 20 feet away, through a maintenance tunnel that connected to the old storm drain system. "We could make this easy for you." Morrison's voice was closer now, maybe 30 feet away. "Accident investigation shows 2 brothers overcome by carbon monoxide while hiding in an abandoned bunker. Tragic, but believable. Or," he continued, "you could help us clean up this mess. Your grandfather left breadcrumbs scattered across 3 states. Help us find them all. And maybe you live long enough to understand why some secrets are worth killing for." Jake squeezed Danny's shoulder twice, their old signal from childhood games of hide and seek. Danny squeezed back once. "Ready." The emergency lighting flickered, casting wild shadows across the walls. In that moment of distraction, both brothers moved toward their only chance at survival. The safe house felt more like a tomb than sanctuary. Jake paced the cramped living room while Marcus hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table, the glow from the screen casting harsh shadows across his face. 3 days had passed since they'd fled the farm, and the weight of isolation was crushing them both. "Anything?" Jake asked for the 10th time that morning. Marcus shook his head. "The news is still calling it a gas explosion. No mention of bodies, no mention of us. It's like we never existed." Jake stopped pacing and stared out the window through a gap in the heavy curtains. The run-down neighborhood stretched before them, cracked sidewalks, abandoned lots, and houses that had seen better decades. Agent Chen had chosen this place specifically for its anonymity, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were sitting ducks. "We can't stay here forever," he said. Chen said 48 hours minimum. It's been 72. Then something's wrong. Marcus closed the laptop with more force than necessary. "Everything's wrong, Jake. Our farm is gone. Our lives are gone. We're hiding from people who probably have access to every surveillance camera in the country." The brothers had spent the past 3 days poring over the documents they'd managed to save from the bunker. The picture they painted was even more disturbing than they'd initially realized. Project Blackwater hadn't just been about monitoring Soviet communications. It had been about eliminating anyone who might expose the illegal surveillance operations being conducted on American soil. Their grandfather hadn't been a hero. He'd been a liability. Jake's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. "Don't talk. Just listen." Chen's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm blown. They know I helped you. Meet me at the location I showed you on the map, the one with the red tent 30 minutes. Come alone." The line went dead. "That was Chen," Jake said, grabbing his jacket. "She wants to meet. I'm coming with you," she said alone. Marcus stood up, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "Like hell, we're in this together." Jake wanted to argue, but the truth was, he didn't want to face this alone either. They'd already lost too much. The 20-minute drive took them through increasingly desolate parts of the city until they reached an abandoned industrial complex that looked like it hadn't seen activity since the steel industry collapsed. Chen was waiting by a rusted loading dock, but she looked nothing like the composed federal agent they'd first met. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair disheveled, and there was a nervous energy about her that set Jake's teeth on edge. "You brought your brother," she said when they approached. "We're a package deal," Marcus replied. Chen nodded grimly. "Good. You're going to need each other for what comes next." She led them inside one of the empty warehouses. Their footsteps echoed in the vast space, and Jake couldn't help but notice how Chen kept glancing over her shoulder. "They killed Director Morrison this morning," she said without preamble. "Made it look like a heart attack, but I know better. He was the only person in the Bureau who believed our investigation was legitimate." Jake felt his stomach drop. "What about the evidence? The documents?" "Officially, they never existed. Unofficially, there are people very high up in the government who want this buried forever." Chen reached into her jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "This is everything I could salvage before they locked down my access. Names, dates, bank records, proof that Blackwater never really ended. It just went underground." Marcus took the envelope with trembling hands. "What are we supposed to do with this?" "Disappear," Chen said flatly. "New identities, new lives, new everything. I've got contacts who can help, but it's going to cost." "How much?" Jake asked. "Everything. Your past, your family name, any hope of normal lives. You'll be ghosts." The warehouse fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic. Jake stared at the envelope in his brother's hands, thinking about their grandfather's journal entries. The old man had written about the weight of secrets, about how some knowledge was too dangerous to possess. Now Jake understood what he'd meant. "There's something else," Chen continued. "The explosion at your farm? It wasn't meant to destroy the bunker. It was meant to destroy you. They know you have the documents, and they're not going to stop hunting until you're silenced permanently." A sound from outside made all three of them freeze, the crunch of gravel under tires. Chen drew her weapon. "We need to move. Now." But as they turned toward the back exit, Jake saw shadows moving across the windows. They were surrounded. "This way," Chen whispered, leading them deeper into the warehouse. Behind them, the main doors burst open, and Jake heard the coordinated footsteps of what sounded like an entire tactical team. The game of cat and mouse was about to become deadly serious. The emergency meeting location Marcus had chosen was an abandoned grain elevator 20 miles east of the farm, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky like the ribs of some ancient beast. Jake pulled the truck behind a cluster of rusted machinery, the headlights cutting through morning mist that clung to the overgrown lot. Tommy sat rigid in the passenger seat, a manila envelope containing copies of the most damning documents pressed against his chest like armor. "You sure we can trust him?" Tommy asked for the third time since leaving the safe house. Jake killed the engine, studying the shadows around the elevator. "Right now, he's all we've got." They waited in tense silence until a black sedan emerged from behind the grain elevator. Marcus stepped out alone, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled, his face haggard in the growing light. He approached their truck with measured steps, hands visible. "You look like hell," Jake said, as they met halfway between the vehicles. 48 hours without sleep will do that." Marcus glanced around nervously. "My entire division is compromised. Director Walsh isn't just covering for Blackwood, he's been feeding them intel since this whole thing started." Tommy held up the envelope. "Then these documents are our only leverage." Marcus reached for it, but Tommy pulled back. "First, tell us about our grandfather. Everything." "Harold Henderson was recruited in 1972, Marcus began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Blackwood needed someone invisible, someone with property remote enough for their operations but respectable enough to avoid suspicion. Your grandfather was perfect, a war veteran, respected farmer, family man. They convinced him it was patriotic duty." "What operations?" Jake demanded. "Human experimentation, mind control research that made MK Ultra look tame. The barn was just the entrance. The real work happened in those tunnels. Prisoners, volunteers who didn't volunteer, foreign nationals who disappeared without a trace." Marcus's face contorted with disgust. "Your grandfather discovered the truth in 1974 and tried to back out. That's when they made it clear backing out wasn't an option." Tommy's hands shook as he processed this. "So he just went along with it?" "He documented everything, every face, every experiment, every death. I think he always planned to expose them, but Blackwood had leverage. Your grandmother's cancer treatments, your father's college fund, threats against the entire family." Harold was trapped. A distant rumble made them all freeze. Jake spotted a line of black SUVs cresting the hill to the west, moving fast. "Company," Marcus cursed. "Walsh must have tracked my phone. Give me the documents, I can still get them to the right people. Or you can hand them straight to Walsh," Tommy countered. The SUVs were closing fast, kicking up dust clouds. Marcus pulled a small device from his pocket, a satellite phone. "This connects directly to the Washington Post. One call and this story breaks wide open. But I need those documents as proof." Jake grabbed Tommy's arm. "We have to decide now." Tommy stared at the envelope, then at Marcus, then at the approaching convoy. The weight of 3 generations pressed down on him. His grandfather's terrible secret, his father's ignorant peace, and now their own desperate gamble for justice. "How do we know you won't just destroy them?" "Because my daughter's in witness protection because of these bastards," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "They threatened her when I started asking questions. I want Blackwood buried as much as you do." The lead SUV was close enough that Jake could see the tactical gear through the windshield. He made the decision for both of them, grabbing the envelope from Tommy and thrusting it at Marcus. "Make the call." Marcus was already dialing as they sprinted back toward their truck. Jake gunned the engine, spinning gravel as they tore away from the grain elevator. In the rearview mirror, he saw Marcus standing his ground, phone pressed to his ear, even as the first SUV skidded to a stop beside him. "Did we just sign his death warrant?" Tommy asked, gripping the dashboard as Jake took a sharp turn. "Maybe. Or maybe we just saved everyone." Behind them, more vehicles were peeling off to pursue them, but Jake knew these back roads better than any federal agent. He cut through a farmyard, scattered a flock of chickens, and emerged onto a county highway heading south. Tommy was monitoring police scanners on his phone. Multiple agencies involved now. FBI, state police, even some kind of federal task force. Good or bad. Depends on which side they're on. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Story breaks in 1 hour. Find somewhere safe and wait. The cavalry is coming. M." For the first time in days, Jake felt something that might have been hope. The truth was finally loose, spreading through digital channels that Blackwood couldn't control or contain. Whatever happened next, their grandfather's terrible secret would no longer be buried in the darkness beneath an old barn. The question now was whether they'd live to see justice done. The safe house felt more like a prison with each passing hour. Jake paced the small living room while Marcus sat hunched over the laptop, his fingers flying across the keys as he uploaded encrypted files to secure servers across 3 different continents. The weight of their grandfather's secret pressed down on them like a physical force. "How much longer?" Jake asked, checking the window blinds for the 100th time. The street remained empty, but that didn't ease the knot in his stomach. "Almost done," Marcus muttered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. "Once these hit the servers, there's no stopping it. Every major news outlet, every investigative journalist, every government oversight committee, they'll all have copies." Agent Sarah Chen emerged from the kitchen, carrying 3 cups of coffee, her normally composed demeanor showing cracks of exhaustion. She'd barely slept since they'd arrived, coordinating with her contacts and building their evidence package. "My source at the Washington Herald confirms they're ready to run the story. Front page, above the fold." Jake accepted the coffee gratefully, his hands trembling slightly. "What about the people we're exposing? Senator Morrison, Director Hayes, all those others in the documents?" "They're already moving," Chen said grimly. "My contacts report unusual activity at several government agencies, files being shredded, hard drives being wiped. They know something's coming." The laptop chimed softly, and Marcus leaned back with a deep exhale. "It's done. Every document, every photo, every piece of evidence we found in that bunker is now safely distributed across multiple secure servers. Even if they try to suppress it, they can't," Chen finished. "Too many copies, too many journalists, too many countries." Jake felt a strange mixture of relief and terror wash over him. For weeks, they'd carried this burden alone, uncertain who to trust or how to proceed. Now the truth would finally see daylight, but he knew their troubles were far from over. "There's something else," Chen said, setting down her coffee cup. "Something I haven't told you yet." Both brothers turned to face her, and Jake didn't like the expression on her face. "The night you first contacted me, someone tried to access your grandfather's military records. Deep access, the kind that requires high-level clearance. When that was blocked, they tried to pull records on both of you." "Meaning?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Meaning, someone very powerful wanted to know everything about your family before they decided how to handle you. The fact that they haven't moved directly against us yet suggests they're still hoping to contain this quietly." Jake's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen to find a text from an unknown number. His blood turned to ice as he read the words, "Your grandfather was a patriot who understood the value of silence. Be smart like him. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." He showed the message to Chen, who immediately began typing on her own phone. "We need to move. Now." "But the files are already uploaded," Marcus protested. "That was never going to stop them from trying," Chen replied tersely. "They'll want to silence us before the story breaks, claim we're unreliable sources or dangerous extremists. Dead witnesses can't give interviews or testify before Congress." As if summoned by her words, a black sedan rolled slowly past the window. Jake caught a glimpse of the driver, a man in a dark suit speaking into a radio. "Back door," Chen ordered, grabbing her laptop bag and weapon. "There's a car parked in the alley. Keys are under the rear bumper." They moved quickly but quietly through the house, Marcus clutching the external hard drive that contained their grandfather's legacy. Jake's mind raced with thoughts of their family farm, now undoubtedly crawling with federal agents searching for any remaining evidence. The alley was dark, lit only by a single street lamp that cast long shadows between the buildings. Chen's promised vehicle, a nondescript Honda, sat waiting exactly where she'd indicated. As Marcus retrieved the keys, Jake heard the distant sound of car doors slamming shut from the street they'd just left. "They're here," he whispered. Chen nodded, checking her weapon one final time. "The story breaks in 6 hours. We just need to stay alive until then." They climbed into the Honda, and Jake couldn't help but think about how their grandfather must have felt during those final weeks of his life, knowing what he'd hidden, knowing the danger that knowledge represented. Had he hoped his grandsons would never find that bunker, or had he always intended for the truth to eventually surface? As they pulled out of the alley and into the night, Jake realized it no longer mattered what their grandfather had intended. The secret was out now, spreading across the internet like wildfire, impossible to contain or control. Behind them, flashlights swept through the windows of the safe house they'd just abandoned. Soon, very powerful people would wake up to find their carefully buried past splashed across newspaper headlines around the world. The Henderson brothers had finally finished what their grandfather started 50 years ago. The headlights swept across the farmhouse as Marcus and Jake crouched behind the old grain silo, their hearts hammering against their ribs. 3 black SUVs rolled up the gravel driveway, their engines purring with mechanical precision that seemed foreign against the rural backdrop of chirping crickets and rustling corn. "They found us," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. Marcus pressed his back harder against the weathered wood, clutching the manila envelope containing the most damaging documents they'd discovered. Inside were proof of payments, assassination orders, and a list of names that included 2 former presidents and a current Supreme Court justice. The weight of the papers felt heavier than lead in his trembling hands. Car doors slammed in rapid succession. Through a gap in the silo's planking, Marcus counted 6 figures emerging from the vehicles, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They wore dark clothing and moved like shadows across the yard, spreading out to surround the house. "The tunnel," Marcus breathed. "We can still make it to the tunnel." They'd discovered the escape route yesterday while exploring deeper into their grandfather's bunker, a narrow passage that led from the underground facility to an old root cellar nearly half a mile away in the woods. Their grandfather had been more paranoid than they'd initially realized, and now that paranoia might save their lives. The brothers crept along the back of the silo, keeping low as they made their way toward the barn. Behind them, flashlight beams swept across the farmhouse windows, and they heard the splintering crack of the front door being kicked in. "Search every room," a voice commanded, carrying clearly across the night air. "They can't have gone far." Marcus recognized the voice immediately. Agent Crawford from Homeland Security, the same man who'd visited them 3 days ago claiming to be investigating irregularities in their grandfather's military service record. The same man who'd seemed far too interested in whether they'd found anything unusual among their grandfather's belongings. They reached the barn and slipped inside, their feet knowing every creaking board by memory now. Marcus triggered the hidden mechanism that opened the floor panel, and they dropped into the bunker below. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on the walls lined with filing cabinets and document boxes. "Jake, grab that hard drive from the desk," Marcus whispered urgently. "I'm getting the backup files." As Jake moved toward the corner office, a new sound froze them both. Footsteps on the barn floor above. Heavy boots walked slowly across the wooden planks, pausing directly over the concealed entrance. "I know you're down there, boys." Crawford's voice drifted through the floorboards, calm and conversational. "Your grandfather was a stubborn man too. Thought he could expose Operation Blackwater and live to tell about it. He was wrong." Marcus's blood turned to ice. His grandfather hadn't died of a heart attack. He'd been murdered. "Here's what's going to happen," Crawford continued. "You're going to come up here nice and quiet, and you're going to hand over every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence you've collected. In exchange, I'll make this quick and painless. Keep hiding, and I promise you'll regret it." Jake had reached the desk and was frantically shoving files into a backpack. Marcus grabbed a second bag and started loading it with the most critical documents, the ones that proved Operation Blackwater had been a government-sanctioned program to eliminate American citizens who posed security risks. The footsteps above moved toward the hay bales where the entrance mechanism was hidden. "Found it," Crawford called out to his team. "Northwest corner, under the loose boards." Marcus grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him toward the back wall where the tunnel entrance lay concealed behind a false panel. They had maybe 30 seconds before Crawford and his men broke through. The tunnel was narrower than Marcus remembered, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees through the claustrophobic passage. Behind them, they heard the floor panel crash open and boots hitting the bunker floor. "Spread out," Crawford shouted. "Check every corner. They've got to be here somewhere." Marcus and Jake crawled faster, their knees scraping against the rough concrete floor. The tunnel seemed endless in the darkness, stretching ahead like a throat waiting to swallow them. Marcus's lungs burned as he forced himself forward, the precious documents weighing down his backpack. A beam of light suddenly pierced the tunnel behind them, followed by Crawford's voice, closer now and edged with fury. "Found their rabbit hole. Richards, take 2 men and circle around to the woods. They're heading for the old root cellar." Marcus's muscles screamed as he pushed himself harder, Jake panting beside him. The tunnel finally began to slope upward, and ahead he could see the faint outline of the exit. They were almost free. But as they reached the ladder leading up to the root cellar, they heard something that made their blood freeze. The sound of car engines starting up outside, moving to intercept them. Crawford had anticipated their escape route. They were trapped. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Henderson farm as FBI vehicles lined the gravel driveway like a convoy of justice. Agent Sarah Chen stepped out of the lead car, her breath visible in the crisp autumn air, and surveyed the property that had become the epicenter of the most significant government corruption case in decades. Marcus and David Henderson stood beside the old barn, no longer the uncertain young men who had stumbled upon their grandfather's secret just weeks ago. The weight of their discovery had aged them, but also strengthened their resolve. They watched as federal agents carefully extracted box after box of documents from the underground bunker, each container representing another piece of the vast conspiracy their grandfather had helped expose. "Your grandfather was braver than any of us realized," Agent Chen said, approaching the brothers. "The recordings we found in that hidden compartment, they're going to bring down some very powerful people." Marcus nodded, his hand resting on the faded photograph they'd discovered in the bunker's deepest recesses. It showed their grandfather, shaking hands with a young government whistleblower who had disappeared in 1973. Now they knew why. Thomas Henderson had risked everything to provide a safe house for the man whose leaked documents would eventually reshape American intelligence oversight. The sound of approaching helicopters drew their attention skyward. News crews had been circling since dawn, but these aircraft bore different markings. David recognized the insignia from his military service. This was a joint task force operation. "Senator Morrison's been arrested," Agent Chen announced, checking her secure phone, "along with 3 other sitting congressmen and a handful of CIA veterans. The evidence you preserved is airtight." In the distance, a black sedan pulled up to the farmhouse. David tensed, old instincts from his time overseas kicking in, but Agent Chen raised a calming hand. "That's Deputy Attorney General Williams. She wanted to thank you personally." As the morning progressed, the scope of their grandfather's operation became clearer. The bunker hadn't just housed documents. It had been a sophisticated intelligence node, complete with communication equipment that had allowed Thomas Henderson to coordinate with other patriots working to expose the conspiracy from within. The rusted chains on the barn had been the only thing standing between this evidence and those who would have destroyed it. Marcus found himself thinking about the letter they'd discovered, written in their grandfather's shaky handwriting during his final days. In it, he'd expressed hope that his grandsons would one day be strong enough to handle the truth. The old man had died knowing that powerful enemies were still searching for the evidence, still willing to kill to protect their secrets. "The Hartley family sends their regards," Agent Chen mentioned quietly. "Jonathan Hartley's widow never stopped believing her husband was murdered for what he knew. Thanks to you, she'll finally get justice." The bunker's entrance, once hidden beneath decades of debris and careful camouflage, now swarmed with forensic specialists. They worked methodically, cataloguing each document, each photograph, each piece of evidence that would help prosecutors unravel 40 years of corruption and cover-ups. "What happens to the farm?" Marcus asked. Agent Chen smiled, the first genuine smile they'd seen from her since this all began. "It stays yours, of course, though I suspect you'll have historians and researchers asking for access to the bunker for years to come. Your grandfather's work is going into the textbooks." As the afternoon wore on, the media presence intensified. Reporters shouted questions from beyond the police perimeter, eager for any detail about the biggest political scandal since Watergate. But the Henderson brothers had already decided they would let their actions speak louder than any interview. The last of the evidence boxes disappeared into secure transport vehicles just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Agent Chen approached them one final time, extending her hand in farewell. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said simply. After the federal convoy disappeared down the country road, Marcus and David stood alone beside the barn that had started it all. The rusted chains lay in a heap nearby, finally serving their purpose after decades of protecting secrets that needed to see daylight. "Think we did the right thing?" David asked. Marcus looked across the fields their family had worked for generations, then down at the open bunker entrance where their grandfather had risked everything for truth and justice. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think we finally finished what he started." The farm fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through autumn leaves, carrying away the last echoes of old conspiracies and welcoming the possibility of a more honest tomorrow.